How are we sounding? Good? All right, well, welcome to workshop number 6, or community meeting number 6 for the GSP. Such a nice day out today. I can't believe you guys opted to come here and listen to us talk about groundwater, but we do appreciate it. We're at meeting 6, and we've covered Sigma overview, the law itself, what's required of the law. We've covered some of the history of the basin. We've covered the conceptual model of the basin setting, basically what we know about the basin, how it recharges, how water leaves, how water gets extracted, the amount of water. We've looked at the water budget, meaning water in and water out over many years. We've looked at what makes sense as a base period for us to analyze to understand better what the future will bring. We use that to develop a future water budget, trying to project out into 50 years out into the future to see if there's going to be problems with making sure that the basin is sustainable. We've talked about the numeric model that we've developed as a tool and all the data that we've put in and calibration process and how well it's calibrated. We then moved into what we call the sustainable management criteria, which are defined by the state law. And there are 6 of them. We talked about all 6 of them. 3 we talked more about, 3 we talked less about. The 3 that we talked more about were seawater intrusion, groundwater levels, and groundwater and storage. Then the 3 that we didn't talk as much about were water quality and subsidence and surface water, groundwater interaction. So we've covered all that. We're kind of at the end of that, and we're now going to be wrapping up the sustainable management criteria, which are basically defining a regulatory level, if you will, for those various criteria to indicate whether or not we're in compliance or we're in sustainability and compliance with the SGMA. The next step is, okay, are we in compliance? That will require years of monitoring and looking at these SMCs and trying to figure out, okay, are we complying with the law? And how are we going to comply with the law with management actions and projects? And so we'll touch on that tonight, but then next month we'll be diving into the PMAs, or project management, projects and management actions. Tonight we're doing, most of the discussion will be wrapping up the SMCs. So basically we've discussed this, we've kind of gone around and looked at this from many different angles, had some public input. Now we've, as a technical team, have come together and said, okay, this is how we're going to define these SMCs. So there will be some connection between, okay, we define these, what does that mean? So, that's where we're at. Meeting 6, I expect we'll have at least one more meeting, maybe a couple of more meetings after this to discuss kind of wrapping it up. And the goal of all of this is to put together a groundwater sustainability plan that will have all of these things included in the plan. And then we'll submit it to DWR, and hopefully they'll say, it looks great, you do nothing else, you're on your way. So, so tonight, for those of you who have been here before, Dave O'Rourke's been doing the brunt of the technical presentations. Robert Marks is also here from Pueblo. David's from GSI. And so with that, David, I'll hand it over to you to start the presentation on SMCs.
Thanks, Robert. Okay, there's that. So yeah, I'm Dave O'Rourke. I'm a hydrogeologist with GSI. I recognize most of you from previous meetings. I'm going to quickly go through some review stuff. I kept it in here in case anybody had not been to a meeting prior to this, but this is the outline of what we're doing, a brief review of GSPs and SMCs. The brunt of this meeting is going over the SMCs for the 6 sustainability indicators, and then a quick introduction of the projects and management actions that we see, that are going to be included in the GSP. Very brief introduction. There'll be more details about those at the next meeting. Just a reminder of where we are. We're still here in phase 2, sustainable goal setting. This is the last public meeting where we're going to be discussing this. Phase 3 starts this summer. We talk about projects and management actions and plan implementation, and get that document fully written so it can be posted for public review and ultimately turned in on time. So we're here in April. This is, as I said, it's the final presentation of the SMCs. We're going to reach consensus for what's going to be included in Chapter 7 and Intro to Projects and Management Actions. In May through this summer, we'll be talking about projects and management actions implementation, and then in the fall, we'll prepare final preparation of the document posted for public review. So a quick review as SMCs. Now, as Robert mentioned one time, I don't remember if it was in this meeting or one of our technical phone meetings, it's been kind of interesting with the technical group, you know. He's like, I'm used to knowing what the answer is before, you know, before we start a meeting, and that has definitely not been what this process has been like, you know. Put 5 geologists in a room and they don't always come up with the same opinions. But we are landing on something tonight, and what I present to you tonight for the sustainable management criteria is what we're moving forward with. So there's a few tables that are included in this, and you know, we think they're technically sound and, most important, defensible. And that's what we're going to be moving forward with. So the 3 big ones for this basin are seawater intrusion, that's the first one. Lowering of groundwater levels and reduction of storage. Those 2 are inextricably linked and will be presented as a single set of wells and MTs. We will be discussing water quality degradation, SMCs, and monitoring well network. And these last 2 are very brief because they're not much of an issue in this basin. Just a reminder of some of the acronyms. You know, MTs are the minimum thresholds. Those are the numerical values that have teeth in this GSP. If you don't meet the MT, that triggers an action. You know, first action's usually study, and if it's determined to be noteworthy or consistent or significant, you know, it could result in some sort of management action. MO is a measurable objective. So for water levels, a measurable objective is higher than the MT, and the MO is kind of aspirational. You don't get dinged if you're not at the MO. Together, those are both sustainable management criteria, and the other one we use a lot is RMS wells, representative monitoring sites. So this is just a little figure showing how everything comes together. You know, the sustainability goal is the overarching thing that everything is being done for. MOs and MTs are both SMCs. They are defined at the RMS wells. The RMS wells are the one where you define those numerical goals, the MTs and MOs. There is a broader, larger monitoring network, which the district will continue to monitor. But the 30 or so wells in there, not all of them are RMS wells. They'll just be used to take water levels and collect samples and generate water level maps and things that'll be required in the annual report. And then projects are generally to increase supply. Management actions are largely to reduce demand, and you measure their effects at the RMS well network. So everything gets measured at the RMS wells. Okay, so that's your quick review. I spent about an hour on that at the first meeting. So we're going to talk about seawater intrusion. Again, I think I've shown you 2 or 3 iterations, you know, one with 2 lines, one with a different MT. But, you know, the undesirable result we're trying to avoid is saline water migrating inland and either hitting municipal production wells and affecting their ability to produce water for their service area, or hitting ag wells and affecting their ability to make a living. Again, so the seawater intrusion minimum threshold is defined as an isocontour. So the regulations state that, you know, you got to draw a line on a map and assign an MT to that line. It doesn't necessarily mean, you know, we've got the data today to absolutely define that line, but that's what the MT is. It's a line with a specific concentration of chloride assigned to it. And this is what we have landed at. This line, this red line, it starts up here by Montecito, comes down, swoops down here a little bit, and then comes over. We don't extend it beyond the fault because we're protected from seawater intrusion by fault blocks over there. But this line is defined by the active wells in the district. So.
Hey, Dave, can you break for a second? Mm-hmm. So can we hold questions to the end just so we can get through the presentation? Sure. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't see you there, but we'll get them at the end. So the line is defined, by the most coast, the active wells in the district that are nearest to the coast. And we have assigned the MT at 250 milligrams per liter chloride. That's the secondary maximum contaminant level. That's a drinking water standard. Secondary MCL means it's a taste and odor thing. It's not a human health issue, but it is a defined standard. And we talked about maybe using a lower one. There's a number in the Regional Water Central Coast Basin Plan of 142 milligrams per chloride for irrigation that says no problem. It's in the no problem column. We talked about using that. But in the end, we're using this line. The MT is 250. The MO, we're assigning it as that value of 142. So any wells that are along here, it may be hard to see these white wells. There's about 6 or 7 of them along this line. Those will be RMS wells. And if the basin is managed properly and correctly and we keep seawater intrusion at bay, chloride concentrations in those actual wells will be between 142 and 250 for chloride. So as we told you, this specifically excludes this area around Arroyo Paredon Creek where there are noted historical high levels of chloride. They're likely associated with the surface water quality of that creek water flowing out of the mountains. So we're not trying to clean up things that already exist. So it does specifically exclude those. So those are behind the line, but they don't count. We'll define them out of being an issue by showing the data that they're already high and it's naturally occurring and has nothing to do with seawater intrusion. You'll be able to spot these numbers better when it's a figure in the report, but you can take my word for it when I tell you that none of the chloride values, we put the maximum chloride value since 2015 on a bunch of these wells, and none of them are above 250 at present. So at present, all the wells north of that line conform to this MT, and there is definitely going to be additional monitoring wells, installed between that line and the coast. The district's already applied for funding for those things. It's definitely an objective in the near term to get. Right now, they've just got the 3 wells at the Sentinel well, but they're going to get a few more of those along the coast. So those wells will not be RMS wells, so those won't be, if they get above 250, that's not a trigger. It's the wells along the line that are the trigger. But those monitoring wells be like the front, it'll be the first thing that we'll see. It'll be the canary in the coal mine, for lack of a better term. But so yeah, one line defined by the closest active wells to the coast. The MT is set at 250, which is secondary MCL. The MO is set at 142, which is the no problem chloride level for irrigation water in the basin plan. It excludes historically high levels near Arroyo Paredon Creek, and there are plans on the books to add additional monitor wells south of the line. So that's where we landed on seawater intrusion. We think it's solid, we think it's defensible, and after numerous iterations, this is what we'll be writing up. Okay, now I'm going to talk at a little more length about reduction of groundwater levels and reduction of groundwater and storage. The undesirable effects we want to avoid here are water levels getting too low, that they have undesirable effects like the district wells. We don't want those water levels going below the screen. Ag wells, we don't want them declining such that there is a reduction of yield that affects their their ability to raise their crops. Things we analyze are location, depth, screened interval, and saturated thickness. As is commonly done and has been done in about every other GSP that's been submitted and all of the ones that have been accepted, reduction in storage SMCs are usually defined as with the same monitoring network and the same MTs as reduction in water level. I mean, you can imagine they're pretty inextricably linked. If your water levels go down, obviously there's less groundwater in storage in the basin. So this is the proposed RMS monitoring network. It's all the big green dots. I believe there's 10 of them. We'll monitor those for water levels. I want to point out there's a couple of areas on the sides of the basin where, would be good to have an RMS well, but right now we don't. Those happen to be, where the official boundaries of the basin were extended a couple of years ago, and it's not part of the traditional area that the district has served. So, they've been monitoring water levels and wells for about 25 years through most of the basin, but not up here and not down here. So as a result, we don't have a whole lot of data, historical data. There are a couple of wells up here by Montecito, but they just started monitoring them recently, so there's not a good period of record that we can define an MT on. So we'll call that a data gap and say, maybe we'll get some, there's already wells here, and maybe we can either install or find an appropriate well in Ventura County. But those are the wells, so I'm going to run through hydrographs for each of these and talk about how we came up. We want to look at the hydrographs at how low has it gotten, and then, how did we land on our MT. MOs, again, those are sort of that's the high level. That's kind of where you want to be. It has no regulatory teeth or anything. So we just want to look at, pre-drought average conditions, or in the case where something has just been declining consistently for 50 years, which doesn't happen in this basin, the sigma baseline is to get it back to 2015 conditions. So those are both things to keep in mind for the MO. Okay, for the MT, this is took a lot more discussion. We've looked at the historical record, all the water levels, all these wells. We've noticed that, there's been 3 big droughts in the recent period of record since the 50s, big one in the 50s, 80s and 90s, and then recently, 2010s. When we come out of the droughts, the water levels have always gone back up, so there's no reason to think that things have changed now. We're not pumping any more now than we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I mean, plus or minus, there's been no huge increase in pumping over the previous years. So a couple of considerations while we're setting these MTs. Were undesirable effects observed? We've gotten no reports that they have. We're still going to be reaching out to a couple of the local ag reps to, at least have a conversation or two that we can document. But nobody's told us that they had to, that their pumps were sucking dry, or that they had to, that they were, I'm sure there were operational things that had to be done to keep your crops going, but we haven't heard that there was significant and unreasonable effects during the recent drought. So one of the first things we thought about, well, maybe if water levels, are observed to go into the screen, that could be considered undesirable. But when we looked into the data, we saw plenty of wells in this basin. The water levels are already, below the top of the screen. So that didn't really pan out as a actual, something to analyze. Then we looked at reduction of saturated thickness. That's what we ended up running with. We want to point out that, it may be entirely reasonable to set the MTs lower than the recently observed low water levels. If the water levels in 2018, the farmers managed to grow their crops and didn't have to take fallow land, then maybe that's okay. And we proceeded with the assumption that that would be okay. And then the analysis I'm going to show you in a little bit is to decide how much lower maybe would be reasonable. In areas along the coast at risk of seawater intrusion, you probably don't want to do that. But we've already, identified our RMS well network for seawater intrusion, and that's just for measurement of chloride. Ultimately, this is details for the text, but most other basins that I've been involved with, it's not like the first time one well, drops below the MT that, you got to stop or something drastic happens immediately. First thing is you usually define it as 2 consecutive years, and then you look at it and do a quick study and say, is it truly significant? Is it reflected in other wells around the area? And only then would you move on to management actions to defend it. But anyway, so I'm going to move on to what we're calling the well impact analysis. So this was, again, we want to give the ag people here a little breathing room. We didn't want to just set it at the recent low and then say, okay, if it goes below that, if this is one wet year and we get another 5 dry ones, are we going to be immediately in exceedance of that MT? We want to avoid that. We have the ability to define these conditions as we think is reasonable. So here's what we did. We took the district's database, well database. There's about 177 wells in there that have screen information. That is most of them. It may not be all of them. There's some that don't have screen information, but it's certainly the preponderance of them. Then we took fall of 2018 water levels. There are water level maps developed twice a year for the annual reports. So we took fall of 2018 as representative of the recent low conditions. And we took that surface and we performed a GIS exercise where we took that water level surface and then dropped it 5 feet at a time in increments from 5 feet to 50 feet. And we compared, so then we have water, the 2018 water levels at each of those 177 wells, and then, 10 more water levels from 5 to 50 feet lower than that 2018 water level. Then we we compared those water levels to the saturated thickness in the aquifer. And, in my experience, with unconfined aquifers, it's usually a red flag if you get, anywhere near or definitely below 50% of saturated thickness. So we set a threshold at 75% of saturated thickness, and we said, all right, let's use that as a threshold and see how many wells, pop out in this analysis. Again, we're moving forward with the assumption that it's okay to go a little lower than the 2018 levels because, first of all, that the recent drought is not the historical low water levels. A couple of them from back in the 50s were significantly lower. And second of all, as I mentioned earlier, when we come out of these drought cycles, the last 3 major droughts, water levels have increased back up to a reasonable level, and we have no reason to think that's going to change this time. So we proceeded with this analysis. So this is just a little schematic of what we're talking about with saturated thickness. So this is a well. These little lines represent well screen. There might be 2 sections screened. This might be the A zone. This might be the B zone. It might be just a shallow well, it might be just here, but in any event, the saturated thickness, we defined it as the water level minus the bottom of the well. So that's essentially the, the standing water column in the well. And like I said, we took the 2018 water level and we dropped it 5, 10, 15, 20, up to 50 feet, and we checked that. And if it was above this 75% threshold that we defined, we said it's okay. If it's below, we marked it and saw how many there were. So this is just to define, what saturated thickness is and how we calculated it, and we'll start with this one. So the x-axis here is the 0 through 50 feet of decline from the fall 2018 water levels. So we have a whole set of 177 wells with data at each one of these, what is that, 10 points. And, we saw that with a water level decline of 20 to 25 feet, which is where you see this dashed line, we still have 90% of saturated thickness of the aquifer as I just defined it. And since no undesirable results were reported in 2018, we just we're proposing that this is a reasonable threshold. If we can maintain 90% of the saturated thickness from the 2018 conditions, then that's, we still got 90% of the water in the aquifer at that point. So this is the first. So there's 3 lines here. Like I said, for each increment of 5 feet, we put, the blue one's the average, and that's kind of what we're referencing. There's a high and a low. This y-axis is percentage of the original saturated thickness. So in this schematic, it's like, the ratio of this to this, right?
Can we ask definition so we understand?
Sure, I'm.
Yeah, so go back to that chart.
The drawing?
Yeah, is that the bottom of the aquifer?
That's the bottom of the well.
So doesn't saturated thickness depend on then how deep your well is?
It does. And so, and in reality, I don't know if you recall, there's an A, B, and C zone. There's very few wells in the C zone. So in that sense, this is kind of conservative. But yes, the wells that are just shallow, that are A zone wells, they're going to be most prone to have their saturated thickness, be significant. And we try to address that here with the second one that I'm going to show you. But yes, if your well's only 100 feet deep and it's 50 feet to water and you've only got 50 feet, well, if you drop it 50 feet, you're going to be at 0 saturated thickness. So absolutely, it does. So.
I'm just having trouble grasping this, I'm sorry, but does that mean that if somebody has a 1,000-foot well and somebody next door has a 100-foot well, that 100-foot well can limit the thousands, because it would definitely get below saturation, while the 1,000-foot well is in great shape.
Yeah, as you'll see, it's not one exceedance of this is not going to stop everything, and I'll show that with the second graph here. But yes, the shallower wells are the limitation. They're the constraint of this analysis. But well, I mean, let me just finish showing what we've done, and then we can finish.
Just so I don't understand conceptually, if we went across and said, okay, we're going to double the depth of every well, let's say just conceptually, then what that does is that dramatically increases our
the saturated thickness as we've calculated it. Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
So I mean, here, again, so this y-axis is the percent of the original saturated thickness. So that we got max, min, and average. I'm kind of referencing the average, but you can see this gray line, that's based on a couple of shallow wells, It's not a large amount, but they're there. And so that's why we put this on to point that out. On this one, by the time we get out to 50, whatever well this was is down to 10% of the 2018 saturated thickness. So yeah, they would have problems. But I guess it's not, how should I state this, the least common denominator is not going to drive the whole program, I guess, that person could deepen their well if they had the wherewithal. It's not like the water wouldn't be available. That well might be insufficient for a temporary period of time. But, we were just trying to work with the data we had, which is this well database that the district has. It's not going to save every single shallow well. Yeah.
Dave, are you proposing setting your MT based on your saturated thickness?
Well, I'm gonna propose to set the MT based on this water level decline from 2018, because for a reduction of water levels, you have to define a water level. So first, I'm going to go with this graph, and the next one, I'm going to tell you what amount we landed on that is okay, that's lower than the 2018 levels. And then I'm going to show you the hydrographs that show you what those are, and then I'll just give you a summary table at the end. But, to me, so we're looking at the average number here. If you drop it 20 to 25 feet, you are still maintaining 90% of the saturated thickness from 2018. That is certainly enough for the vast preponderance of wells in the basin. So that's the first, occurrence of this 20 to 25 foot value. Okay, now this one, as I mentioned, we set this 75% of saturated thickness threshold as, something that you would prefer to avoid. So again, the x-axis here is feet reduced from the 2018 water level. This y-axis is the number of wells that did not meet that less than 75% or greater than 75% criteria, and this is the percentage of wells. So at the 20 to 25 foot reduction of water level surface, less than 5% of wells would not meet this criteria. Basically we're saying that number of wells, which is, 7, 8, 9 wells in the entire basin, that's a reasonable threshold, to avoid. It's not 0 wells, we're not setting it so that no wells exceed this criteria. 5% of wells in the basin seems reasonable. It's all going to be the shallow ones, obviously. B-zone wells are not going to be they're not going to meet this criteria, or they're not going to have trouble with this criteria. So, so there we are at this 20 to 25 foot level again. So, based on these two pieces of analysis, DWR wants to see some sort of analysis and justification, for what you pick. You can't just say, let's do 25 feet, sounds good, we should be able to live with that. So these analyses are our effort to present data that makes this, criteria to define our MT defensible. So bottom line is, based on these two, analyses of the well data and the differences in water level, you know, we're gonna propose that 20 feet lower than the 2018 water levels is okay. It's reasonable. It shouldn't provide a significant and unreasonable hardship to the well owners into the basin. That's, you know, 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 or 8 might have some problems, but, you know, we're looking at the basin as a whole, and this is what we're moving forward with. Fair statement?
Are you?
So I'll stop for questions now.
Is your question answered? Is your question answered, or?
What question I had, if you had, you know, established it at 10%, how, so there's a certain amount below 2018 fall that comes in at 5%, and it
Right.
looks like that's about 25 feet below. Is that right? Am I reading that right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, 5 comes in at between 20 and 25 feet.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is if we go to 10%, we get about 35 feet, right?
That's correct.
And have you looked historically, like in 1950 when it got absolutely the lowest, where that was on this chart?
I did not look at that. You know, we stopped at 50 feet below 2018. There's one hydrograph I'm going to show that goes back to the 50s. We can have a quick look at it when we get to it and see how much farther down it is. It might be 50 feet. I don't remember off the top of my head. We'll see that one hydrograph though, and we'll have a look.
Yeah, so basically, just so I understand, so you're telling us that at that 5% number, that's going to be the MT.
The MT is going to be the 2018 level minus 20 feet. The MT is defined as a water level, you know, groundwater elevation or depth to water. And that's how I'll be presenting them. So at each one of these 10 wells, I'm going to show you the hydrograph. I'm going to show you where it was in 2018, and I'm going to show you the MO and the MT that we're proposing. So it's defined at those 10 individual points, right? And that's supposed to be representative of the basin, and it is representative of the basin. Each one is representative of the area around it. And I'll show you that too. I went through it last time, but the same hydrographs are being shown again, so I'll demonstrate that again.
Yeah.
So to me, that's kind of the genius of Sigma, because things like pumping, very hard to measure and manage for an entire basin. Water levels, anybody can walk up to a well and go beep, beep, you know what the water level is. So it defines it in terms that are very easy to measure, you know, and we want to avoid being too conservative and defining them such that, you know, it could put people at risk of exceeding the MT if we get another 3 or 4 dry years after this year. That's why we're going lower than the recent low, is we think there's adequate room, you know, in the basin to handle it. We think that if we do that, you know, a small number of wells are going to be affected. Not 0, but a small number. And, you know, the 10 wells that we're proposing, just keep an eye on those water levels. And it's easy to measure, and it's easy to define. Yeah?
Yeah, Dave? The one thing I'm struggling with is you have a calibrated model for the basin. And we're trying to set these MTs, water level MTs. And I'm wondering, have you tried to use the model you have and project forward in time using various time series of future rainfall?
We have not yet. The model will be used to simulate the projects and management actions. You know, there's a you know, there's a specific scope of work attached to that. We did not use the model for this analysis. We used, you know, GIS of the water, you know, the water surface in 2018, and this analysis so it's based on field data, and then an evaluation of what happens if that entire surface was lowered uniformly, which of course is a simplifying assumption. But so no, the model was not used for this analysis. The model will be used to see what happens for the projects and management actions. The model was used for the water budget, which has to be part of the GSP, was not used for this.
So this may be outside the present scope, but it might be an idea for something that could be done at the 5-year update point. But this strikes me a lot as a problem. Like, the question is, if you have a certain amount of money invested and you're trying to live off that, and you can spend at a certain rate going forward into the future, and the question is, am I going to run out of money? And you know, the responses are, some of the inputs are, well, what is the stock market going to do in the future? And you have the data from past stock market behavior. You don't really know what's going to happen in the future, but you can develop some probability curves based on past behavior. So in a sense, we could use past rainfall data and develop probability distribution based on that. And then you can use something called a Monte Carlo simulation that allows you to construct various potential time series. And you can run your model response and look at how far the water levels in your basin drop. And so, and you do that for a different number of rainfall sequences. And the result from all that is you, say at a specific monitoring well, you can say, okay, the water, I have a 90% probability that the water won't drop below X. And so you might be able to use that kind of procedure to come up with your MTs that are based on a more solid footing. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah, well, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, Robert gave a very detailed presentation a couple of meetings ago about the future runs with the model to, you know, what he did to evaluate the future water budget. That does, it replicates the past hydrologic data, but applies the climate change, you know, perturbations as per direction and guidance from DWR. So that is done, that's done. I might argue with you that model results are a more solid footing to define these levels than, you know, the real 2018 water levels that were observed at the end of the drought. And we're proposing, you know, another 20 feet below that to give everybody some breathing room. But having said that, you know, that is a totally reasonable thing to propose. It's not going to get done for this version of the GSP. That requires a lot of model runs. You know, you set it up and.
I missed Bob's presentation on that, but were you able to use some of the information that that those model runs gave you to help guide your MT selection?
I did not use the model results for this analysis, no.
Robert's actually the one to give it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as Dave said, we have developed a 50-year future model scenario based on that 50-year projected budget and climate. And that model run, we can simulate, and we will simulate the water level responses over that 50-year period at each one of these RMS wells, and see whether or not, without any projects or management actions, where the water levels will be at these RMS wells now that these SMC's levels have been established. If it turns out that at any one or more of the RMS wells in the simulation go below the minimum threshold, then that's where a project or management action simulation would come in to achieve those minimum thresholds. So the first thing is to establish what those threshold levels are going to be. So that's what Dave's talking about. Then over the next couple of months, we're going to be running that model scenario to look at, in the absence of projects and management actions, how does the basin look at all of these RMS wells relative to the SMCs that are just being established right now, and see whether we can meet them or not.
Yeah. So
And
it's,
if we don't, then that's again where projects and management actions will be added to the simulations to see what can be done.
so the model is going to be used to sort of reality check these proposed MTs, but we didn't use the model to develop these MTs.
Right.
We use this evaluation to see how many wells might be impacted at various levels.
It seems like potentially you might take the model run results and tweak your MTs if
Well, like I said,
potentially.
first we'll run it with no projects, and if we bust the MTs, then before we change the MTs, we'll do the runs with like the CAP project, which is on the books, and then possibly, you know, the seawater barrier intrusion project, which isn't quite on the books yet, but is, you know, being discussed, and see how that works before we change the MTs. If we can get, you know, basically sustainability is not busting the MTs. So if we can show model runs with the projects and management actions that are being proposed to manage the basin for the next 20, 25 years, 50 years, then the model says that it's sustainable.
Yeah, and it's also important to understand that Sigma requires that the basin achieve sustainability within 20 years. So we have 20 years to get there, and then sustainability needs to be maintained for 30 years. After
What
that.
you're describing sounds good. I think the one potential improvement could be, you know, the challenge is what do you pick for your rainfall time series going forward, and where do you start? And, you know, whatever, if you're using the past rainfall data and simply projecting forward using that,
That-
you know,
that process-
may not be what comes down the pike.
Right, and so that process of how you select the historical past, the 50-year past, to project to the future, that's pretty well prescribed by the Sigma regulations and the DWR's basin or best management practices. And then the team and the GSA have decided that in terms of what perturbations that due to climate might have moving forward, we're just selecting what's called the central tendency of all of the various models. But what could be done, it's not currently part of the plan or the scope, but certainly could be done, is to perturb the data assuming different climate, less rainfall, more rainfall. So you could do something along the lines of a Monte Carlo analysis that you're referring to by changing the conditions in the model to see how sensitive the water levels at any of these RMS wells might be to a different sort of climate.
Yeah, but
Great.
so,
I don't want to dominate the conversation here, and I think that it sounds like you have a handle on the issue I'm raising. So.
Yeah, the future hydrology, like he said, it's pretty well prescribed. There's a set of rules, you know, like you can't pick 50 years where there was two wet periods and only one dry period and sort of stack the deck. It's got to be equal wet and dry, you know. There's 5 or 6 kind of rules that you have to follow.
But if the GSA is interested in performing that kind of sensitivity analysis, like instead of just saying, okay, this is the future and we're going to plan around it, it complies with SGMA regulations and we're good with that. If there's interest in exploring more of these what if, like a sensitivity analysis or an uncertainty analysis about the future, that could certainly be done. It's just not required by SGMA.
Right, and I could see that SGMA might change their stipulated regulations down the pike.
Anything's possible.
Yeah.
Certainly. Yeah.
So in that same conversation,
Hold it up to your mouth.
how is state water availability figured in? For instance, we may have a run of dry years here, but wet years in Northern California and availability of state water and less reliance on the groundwater. Is that in any calculation at this point, or would it be one of those things that would happen as it happens?
Yeah, the DWR's projected state water project deliveries under this specific central tendency climate scenario was provided and incorporated into the overall water budget for the basin. But that just assumes the district's existing state water project contract. It doesn't consider, you know, going out and getting more state water on the open market or anything like that.
Right, and also additional storage facilities or something that they're talking about and will happen probably sooner or later that could change the dynamics. Another question, Dave, you said something to the effect that in talking about private wells, that to your knowledge and to the data, that local wells, local growers had not been significantly adversely affected with the recent drought. But just as an example, and 2 of our wells are in the periphery eastern area, and they were both lowered 50 feet, or I can't remember exactly, but the pumps were lowered.
You lowered the pumps?
Lowered the
Okay.
pumps. So
Okay.
I'm thinking, well, you wouldn't know that.
No.
And then you probably wouldn't also know that as the drought progressed, we shifted to more and more municipal water. So it took the load off the wells in that regard. You also wouldn't know that with rainfall, the levels pop back up quickly. So it's kind of one of those things, and my original question before hearing what you were saying was, what about those peripheral areas where the well production does not really represent what's happening in the basin as a whole?
Well, that's why I need to interview you. You've heard me talk about it at the PAC meetings and at this meeting, and at a minimum, I want to probably call you guys that are on the PAC, and if nobody else reaches out, that's fine. But I do want to talk to you guys, and I've told you, I don't know what happened with you guys. I don't know what your experience is. I want to know it. But yes, lowering a well, lowering a pump, that has to happen sometimes. And but at least you had the available saturated thickness to do it. Buying more municipal water, I'm sure that's not your first choice, but at least you had that option. So yeah, I want to talk to you guys, and so I can document the actual experience over the last 6-8 years.
Well, I would think that in a lot of basins, if not all basins where GSA is happening, that there are those peripheral areas or those areas where
Sure, because
the
it's usually
groundwater
sort of
that's happening-
bowl-shaped, right? It's shallower on the edges and, yeah.
and maybe more over there, deeper over there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just that whole concept of, gee, maybe these wells over here and what's happening there doesn't have enough impact to really even worry about, because it just doesn't represent what's going to fix the problem.
I'd like to, dive into the results of this impact analysis a little more to see like where these wells are, all the shallow ones. I haven't, didn't do that yet, but if only to satisfy my own curiosity and thirst for knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if basically what Dave is saying, the result of this analysis is that if water levels are allowed to go 20,
Say 50 feet.
Let's say 20, well, on your map, 20, or your line, 20, 25 feet below the 2018 level, that 5% of the wells get beyond that 75% saturated thickness reduction. I wouldn't be surprised if we mapped those, that you'd find that those wells that fall into that 5% are actually on the margins of the basin.
Yeah. I do want to have a look at that. So I don't know if it would be included, but it could be. Or at least we could share it with you,
One last question before you go on. Could you go back to page 12?
Now that we're in the questions, we'll ask them.
SMCs,
Yeah.
seawater.
Where does that red line end?
It ends at the end of the basin here with the,
No, on the other
Montecito.
end.
It ends at the Rincon Creek Fault.
Okay, so that's on the Rincon Creek.
If you go back and look at either the chapter 3, the conceptual model, the basin setting, there's a bunch of figures in there of the geologic cross sections, or I showed those again in the meeting 2 months ago. Basically, those fault blocks protect this area from seawater intrusion. So we stopped it at the fault.
But the Rincon Fault is not Rincon Creek. Where it ends is about your driveway.
Right, okay.
Or somewhere closer to your driveway.
Right. Yeah, this is the Rincon Creek Fault. It, extends from.
And there's Rincon Creek.
Yeah,
Yeah.
here's Rincon Creek, yeah.
So it's quite a ways away.
Yeah.
If you take the Hall Road that comes past your brother's place
Oh, yeah, right.
and heads towards the ocean, and it terminates at a bank that comes up, and that's right where our property is.
Yeah.
It's right around where that fault is.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay, I got a few hydrographs to get through here, so let me proceed, and then we can wrap up with questions at the end, if you don't all mind. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the period of record hydrographs for the wells that I presented on that RMS well network, and show you what they've done in the past and what we're proposing for the MO and the MT. So this one is 19F4. It's up here, getting toward Montecito on the west end of the district's service area. It's got a nice period of record going back to the 40s. You can see the 50s drought, you can see the 90s drought, and you can see the recent drought. As I mentioned before, on this one, the 50s was not, more extreme than the recent drought. They were about similar. However, we're proposing an MO that's up here about where it was operating around 2010 before the onset of the drought. It's okay to go above the MO. You don't get dinged for being higher water levels. But this MT is 20 feet lower than the 2018 water level. So we're looking at an MO of about 95 feet. I'm expressing these in depths to water. We'll convert them to elevations later, but 95 feet below ground surface for the MO, and about 150 feet below ground surface for the MT. And again, that's based on 20 feet lower than the 2018 water levels.
What are those other series, or those adjacent?
Yeah, this is, those are, yeah, other wells in this section, right? So this is the section, and they were just included in recent, or in previous presentations to demonstrate that this one we picked is in fact representative. So they all have similar patterns. They go up at the same time, they go down at the same time. So, you know, so we picked this one rather than the other ones. And yeah, the heavy line is the hydrograph of the RMS well that we've selected. The thinner ones are just other nearby wells to demonstrate that this is in fact representative. And just every one of these I'm going to show you, we have reached the conclusion that it is in fact representative of the area. Just so I don't have to repeat it 10 more times. But that's what those other hydrograph lines are for. Okay, now we're moving down a little, you know, a little to the east. This is, you know, you can see a depression in the 90s. You can see the recent depression. This one doesn't go back to the 50s, but it's representative. This MT is 20 feet lower than this water level. So in this case, the MO would be about 60 feet below ground surface, or below sea level, or depth of water. And the MT is about 145. So based on, again, I'm just going to click through these, but they're all presenting the historical water levels and the MO based on 20 feet lower than the recent low. Okay, yeah?
Talk a little bit about the saturated thickness on these so that we can tie that in.
Yeah, I don't have the total depth of these wells. I've got the top of screen if we have that data. But if the top of screen is this deep, you know, the well depth is significantly deeper. And so this one would clearly have no problem with that 75% saturated thickness criteria. So again, that 75%, that was just something we applied, you know, to, you know, for the impact analysis. Each one of these, you know, will adhere to that criteria. You know, perhaps when we do the figures for the report, we'll regenerate these hydrographs so that they show the actual total depth of the well. And the top of screen, I kind of tend to not like to do that because then you end up with y-axes that are non-uniform. And I like to have the same absolute value y-axis so you can tell, okay, this one, it looks flat. Well, you can't see any change, then to me that's the message. And if you, on that same axis, you see wild swings, that's important. But I may revisit that, you know, that preference. So yeah, here the top of screen is well below, you know, 200 feet below the MT, so the saturated thickness is not going to be an issue on this one. Okay, now we're moving a little more to the east. This one's sort of up the slopes a little bit. You know, top of screen is a couple hundred feet below the MT, so the saturated thickness is not going to be an issue. The MT is 20 feet lower than the recent low. So we got an MO of about 80 feet below, 80 feet depth of water, and an MT of about 160. Okay, here's one that does go back to the 50s. You know, we're up here now, getting toward the eastern part of the basin. You know, back in the 50s, depth of water was, you know, significantly lower. And in response to your question, let's see, you know, our recent low water level was about 275, and in the 50s, it was about 100 feet lower. So it did get a lot lower there. Again, it's representative. This one, you know, the top of screen is up here, so this one did go into the, you know, below the top of the screen during the drought. If you've got, you know, you still have a couple hundred feet of saturated thickness, you know, I don't know what the operations of this well were, but, you know, the MT based on 20 feet lower is about 300, and the MO is about 220 feet below ground. Okay, now we're moving a little bit south of the previous well. Same thing, no undesirable effects have been reported. We'll be talking to more of you, but you know, every time I've asked, nobody's raised their hands and go, yeah, it was, you know, had to burn my crops. But so here we go, MT about 235 below ground, and MO about 110. So, you know, this, you know, think of this range as your operating level, you know. Again, top of the screen is about down here. There's plenty of saturated thickness there. Okay, now we're starting to move back to the west, but closer to the coast. MT of about 160 feet depth of water, and an MO of about 80 feet depth of water. I guess chime in if you have specific questions, but I'm going through 10 of these that all have the same rationale and logic. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, I'm waiting to have something good to say.
He's thinking.
Yeah, I'm thinking. Yeah, there's so much that goes into it. For instance, when we drill a well, they're going into a new area. They test pump it for 24 or 48 hours. Mm-hmm. And see what the drawdown is. And, you know, I can remember in one case, they said, 200 gallons a minute looks like a safe yield for this. Mm-hmm. Well, we didn't need 200 gallons a minute, so put a 100 gallon a minute pump in there. But now over time, during a drought, it can't keep up at that. Mm-hmm. Where we are, it can't keep up. So, you know, these time frames, and you know, maybe it should have been drilled deeper, and the pump should have, should have been screened deeper. Everything should have been deeper, just because they're kind of making their best guess at the time of doing the well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's just some variables in there, and I think I'll probably think of another question here.
Yeah, it's my mic on? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, what you're talking about is exactly that saturated thickness phenomena. So as the saturated thickness reduces over drought, your pump has less space to draw down, so you have to pump less at a lower rate. So that's why we picked saturated thickness as a proxy to give us, okay, at what point are we going to see undesirable results? That's probably a pretty good way to do it, is just look at what the saturated thickness of every well that we're looking at is, and whether it falls below some objective value, which we picked 75% of the saturated thickness.
You know, following up on that, in some ways it seems a little bit like an artificial construct. You basically have a saturated thickness for, say, your A layer, if you will. And depending on how deep historically a well might be drilled just partly into that A layer, and that was fine back whenever. But, you know, as Scott points out, during a drought, levels drop and you go, oh my gosh, my well's not quite deep enough. And so we're proposing managing the basin based on these existing wells, when in fact I suppose you might think about managing the basin in terms of the actual saturated volume in the basin. Granted, that kind of leaves some well owners high and dry. So it's
done
a
that,
question.
yeah. We've done that as well. I mean, we do look at the total volume of, through the water budget, we look at the balance of water stored in the basin over time.
So I remembered what I wanted to say, and that is, in our basin, when levels do go down, they've always been recoverable. That is to say, there isn't damage done to the basin where, you know, you hear about land subsidence and some of these things where you, actually, I guess you lose the capacity.
Absolutely.
But in our situation, it seems like we maybe should live under some different rules if by overdrafting, it can always recover, or everything we know indicates that it can always recover, which means it's, to me, in my mind, that it's less of an emergency to deal with as compared to a place where capacity is just lost if it's drawn down like that. Is that fairly accurate in our basin?
I think that's accurate, yeah. You're not losing capacity like, you know, due to subsidence. And as I've mentioned, it's during the last 3 droughts, it's recovered to about the same level each time. So given the current level of pumping, there's no reason to, water levels they're correlated obviously with drought and recharge, but also with pumping. So, the pumping, if it has not been increased significantly over the past decades or past years anyway, they've not lost capacity for storage in this basin. No.
Yeah, there's an exception to that, though. We don't have subsidence here, but we have seawater intrusion, which is somewhat irreversible or very difficult to reverse. And so we do have to be cautious about having the basin below a certain level for too long, because that does move seawater into the basin. And yeah, we're definitely trying to balance some flexibility with, sort of just pencil whipping this plan together and trying to get it passed through DWR. We want to make sure that we have flexibility and we can show that we are actually looking at ways to make the basin sustainable, show DWR that we are doing that. I think what Dave's talking about is we've seen 2018, no one really ended up going out of business or having to fallow their crops or anything like that. No real, that we know of, undesirable results occurred in 2018. So the question is, could we have gone another couple of years with drought and still been okay? We were fortunate in 2019 was wet. Then we did have a couple more years, but again, water levels didn't go below where they were in 2018, so we were fortunate. So setting the MT, 20 feet below 2018 is sort of a balanced approach to, let's build a little bit of flexibility into this MT so that we don't get in trouble in 2 years when we have 2 more dry years. But at the same time, we want to make sure we're not ignoring potential problems that will arise if we do get 20 feet below 2018 levels.
One question I wanted to ask, just following on what Jim said, is, and I'm sure there's a good reason, but why didn't you look at just the saturation of the whole basin and just say, okay, we're going to do that at 75% or whatever the number?
Well, we essentially...
It seems conceptually to me that we, just conceptually as a layman, is we'd want to look at something like when we get down to so many years left in the basin, like, I don't know, 50, 75, 100, or whatever it is, at that point, that becomes the MT.
Well, the MTs for water levels and storage, or the MTs for water levels have to be defined as water levels, okay? And I would argue that we essentially did look at it over the whole basin, because we looked at it over 177 individual wells within the basin. And I would argue that it's conservative because it really didn't take into account the C-zone on the vast majority of those 177. I mean, the real saturated thickness would probably be depth, you know, the total depth of the basin, which would have made those numbers look, you know, a lot better. But we're doing it according to the well data, because that's, you know, that's where people experience, you know, the effects of the drought. The water levels decline in their wells to the point they either got to pump less or lower a pump, or maybe it goes dry, you know. So
Yeah, and that I also understood, because it looks like you're looking a little bit at the difficulty it will be for people that have wells, and that issue is being figured in, which is, I think, also a good thing to look at. One last question, then I'll let you go on, but it seems to me like the real constraint here is going to be the salt intrusion. You know, you were touching on that a little bit, but it seems to me that that's probably the thing we primarily have to worry about, not so much down here, but I think up as you move up, right? And that's probably going to turn out to be the serious constraint.
that's definitely the driver in this basin. And, you know, that's why we addressed it first. We've certainly spent the most time talking about it. The projects, you know, that we're going to briefly touch on are largely oriented toward that sustainability indicator.
Okay.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the saturated, you know, the full saturated volume of the basin. You can get in a little bit of trouble by how you define that. Oh, just to touch on the full you know, the idea of using the full saturated volume within the basin. You can get into trouble depending on how you define that. If you define that just the stuff above sea level, which would be the ideal, you know, we don't want water to go below sea level because that causes seawater intrusion, or even actually a little bit above sea level. That volume's relatively small, and so we would be exceeding that probably every few years. So that really doesn't, in a working model, doesn't really work for the way that the basin operates. And so we go back to this idea of undesirable outcomes, and we really look at, okay, is it important to have the basin always above sea level? Probably not. There can be periods where the water can drop below sea level as long as it recovers in a short period of time. That way, you know, seawater doesn't advance a lot during those periods where the water's below sea level. That gives us the flexibility to operate during wet dry cycles, which is how water supply works. You know, it's like a lake. The reason why we build lakes and we don't just let rivers run into the ocean is because rivers dry up. So we want to store that water while the river's wet. It's the same with the basin. We want to have some flexibility to exercise it going up and down. And so to use the full volume is maybe not a good representative of how the basin operates and works and is, you know, actually used.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Just one other question. I'm wondering if you have a feel for how the seawater intrusion MTs compare with the groundwater elevation MTs, and whether, you know, the groundwater, just hypothetically, I could see a situation where the seawater MTs were the critical ones and the groundwater volume MTs were almost insignificant because the others were so much more sensitive and would be exceeded. I'm just wondering if you have a feel for how those interact.
Yeah, I guess the water level MTs that Dave's talking about here and what they're being set at, the unreasonable and significant undesirable effects that are taken into consideration when setting the water level minimum thresholds and MOs. Saltwater intrusion is not one of those considerations. What the water levels need to be to prevent seawater intrusion is a separate issue, and we're going to be dealing with that in the modeling of projects and management actions to get water levels at the coast to keep seawater essentially from moving essentially past the shoreline very much, so that the chloride levels will be met. So, so these water levels are not in and of themselves going to protect the basin from seawater intrusion. There's going to be another layer to this. And I don't know if we're going to talk about projects and management actions tonight or not, but we'll be getting into that in the coming months.
Yeah, you might note that these RMS wells for water levels, you know, they don't run along the coast. They're pretty much on the interior. And then the RMS network for the seawater intrusion, that's more here, and then those are dealt with separately. So they are certainly interconnected, and every section on a sustainability indicator, you have to discuss how one affects the other, and we will. And obviously they are interconnected, or, you know, they affect one another. But for water levels, they're located inland. It's for the ag areas and the district wells. And then the RMSs for the seawater intrusion are more, you know, kind of parallel to 101. So they are presented separately, even though they are interconnected, and would certainly discuss and acknowledge that, but they are presented and discussed separately.
Question, is there any data on the saltwater intrusion during the 1950 drought? Anything at all?
No, nothing at all that I'm aware of.
No.
Well, you guys were here, what happened?
You know, along that line of questioning, I did reach out to Duncan Abbott, who, well, he's older than I am, to see whether he had any information, because they have a ranch down near Santa Claus area, and he just didn't know, so.
His well was up 60 feet, and his home, and it's just docking with him.
Yeah.
It's returned there.
Yeah, so there's two, yeah, the one in Ventura County, I think is the one you're talking about.
Yeah.
The one that's over off of near Santa Claus has always been an impaired water quality, and we've never really been able to determine why that is. We've looked at it several times, but it's sort of like a sore thumb. I think 50 feet away, there's another well that's perfectly clean, and we haven't really figured that out.
Nice $500,000 study would probably answer that for you.
I think we spent some money on trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm through the hydrographs here. This is the last one down here. This is south of the fault. There's area limited groundwater use. You know, again, we propose an MT and an MO based on the recent water levels, 250 and 200. So this is the table we'll be presenting at the end of the water level and groundwater reduction section of the SMC chapter. This 29K2 we had originally shown as a well to be incorporated in the RMS network. There's no, as it turns out, there's not adequate data, to define an MT there. So we scrapped it, and we're down to 9. But this is where the rubber meets the road. This is what we will be summarizing in that chapter. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about water quality. That's the next sustainability indicator that we need to address. I've said it every time I've mentioned water quality. I'll say it again. Sigma is not designed to improve water quality better than conditions as they exist today or they existed in 2015. If you have areas like Arroyo Paredon that have high natural chlorides and TDS, it is not the goal of Sigma to make that better. But it is, it is mentioned as a water quality, as a sustainability indicator, and the goal is to avoid water quality degradation due to groundwater management. Now, what that would look like in this basin is kind of hard to define. The classic example that's obvious that doesn't really apply here is if you have a contaminant plume, that's defined, you don't want to put a well field in down gradient of that would make those contaminants move faster than they otherwise would. So the SMCs that we're going to present here are pretty much just based on either drinking water regulations for the 2 constituents that have human health impacts, historical water quality data, because we don't want to define them lower than they've already been observed, and then the basin objectives for irrigated water that are published in that Central Coast Basin Plan. The district has been, collecting semi-annual water quality samples since about 2000, just for general minerals. And the plan at present, as I understand it, is continue that sampling program because there's just a lot of good data there. It doesn't make any sense to stop it. Okay. I should have made these dots a little bigger, but there are, well, I'll just start here. The constituents of concern, they're not mandated by Sigma, but we've selected these as constituents of concern. Arsenic and nitrate are almost always included because they have primary maximum contaminant levels. They're federal standards that have effects on human health. So those are included as constituents of concern. They will be monitored at the district's supply wells because the district is the only supplier of potable water in the district. So the district's 6 wells, which are these green ones, that's the RMS well network for arsenic and nitrate. And we're including chloride, boron, and TDS just as general indicators of water quality and suitability for agriculture. We selected another 6, kind of just, spatially distributed through the basin. So those are the wells we selected for that. So 5 constituents of concern that we need to define MTs for. And it's the same map here, but as I just said, arsenic and nitrate will be monitored at the 5 district wells. Chloride, TDS, and boron will be monitored at these additional 6 wells. And the MTs that we're talking about for arsenic and nitrate, the MT is defined equivalent to the MCL. That's 10 parts per billion for arsenic and 10 parts per million for nitrate. Nitrate is nitrogen. Those were selected because it's a federal reg for drinking water, and the district wells were selected as the RMS wells because they're the only ones that supply water, potable supply in the basin. Okay, then for these other general suitability for agricultural indicators. TDS, we selected 1,000. That's a secondary MCL for drinking water. But we looked at the data since 2015 in the district's monitoring network. There's plenty that are, in the 700 to 800 range. So we don't. That basin plan had a general plan objective of 700 for TDS. We are, the natural conditions here are higher than 700. So we selected 1,000. It's mainly just for the purposes of monitoring. We'll see if things are changing with time. It takes time to see these things change. Groundwater moves slow, like I've said before. So we selected that secondary MCL for TDS. We'll monitor it, all 11 of the wells, the 5 districts wells and the 6 other ones. Chloride, we selected an MT of 142. That's that no problem for irrigation number that's published in the basin plan. In the central part of the basin, nothing is approaching 142 yet. There are, areas like I mentioned in Arroyo Paradon, where it's definitely higher. There's some areas near, as you get closer to Ventura County, where they are approaching or in excess of 142 now, but not at the RMS wells that we selected. And again, the 24 or so wells that the district's been sampling for water quality for the past 25 years, they will continue to be sampled. So we'll have all this data, through time, but it's only these 11 wells where we're defining these things. And then boron, boron, my understanding is it's kind of crop specific, the tolerance, but that same table in the basin plan that mentions 142 for no problem for chloride mentions 0.5 as a no problem for boron. None of the wells that we've picked for RMS wells exceed 0.5 for boron. They're all like 0.1, 0.2. It does exceed it like over in the Arroyo Paradon area wells, but that's already been defined away as an isolated area that's, not representative of the rest of the basin. So those are the 5 constituents. Those are the MTs. It's the rationale of why we selected them. And, that's it. Again, Sigma wasn't really intended to manage water quality, certainly not trying to improve it. So this is largely going to be an exercise in monitoring moving into the future. Don't see this as being a big trigger for any kind of projects or management actions in the future. With the possible exception of, if there's ASR, then, arsenic issues with that, but that's a completely separate discussion. That's water quality. A lot. See, we're moving faster here now. The last 2 sustainability indicators are interconnected surface water depletion and land subsidence. The interconnected surface water and groundwater indicator, when we presented the basin settings information that Robert presented several meetings ago, we basically characterized the creeks in this basin as this. They're disconnected from, under natural conditions, they're disconnected from the aquifer. When they flow, water percolates to the aquifer, but the aquifer level doesn't rise up to the point where it intersects the creek. The creeks in this basin, they function as storm drains, and when they're running, they percolate, and then they dry up seasonally. So since they are disconnected from the principal aquifer, they're not subject to management under Sigma. Having said that, there might be a few data gaps, where that might need to be addressed during the implementation period, just in terms of putting in a few shallow piezometers to document that these are in fact, disconnected, that we show that the water levels are, well below the base of the alluvial materials. When DWR rejected those half dozen or so GSPs a couple of months ago, they did mention, in that meeting, that they acknowledged that the guidance on this sustainability indicator was kind of unclear, and that they'd be issuing, clarifying information in the future. And one of the guys I know at DWR in Fresno, he said it's probably going to be a model-based analysis, because it's very difficult to actually quantify, surface water, groundwater interaction. So he said it's likely going to be based on model runs, You do a baseline run, and then you do your future run with projects or whatever, and then you see what the model says is the difference in the flux. But it should not be an issue in this basin, because they're essentially disconnected. All right, that was only one slide for that sustainability indicator. Now we got one for subsidence. It's not been an issue in this basin historically. We will not be using wells to monitor this sustainability indicator. As part of the SIGMA program, DWR has taken upon itself the responsibility for developing this INSAR data program. It's a satellite-based data program that can measure changes in land surface of up to, 1/10 of a foot, plus or minus 1/10 of a foot. So this map just shows, the INSAR data for the last 7 years, 2015 to 22. The low there is just, it's 0.13 feet, so barely over 0.1, but it's over 7 years. So this data is going to be, updated every year. It'll be included in the annual reports. But bottom line is, it's not been an issue in the past. Water levels were lower in many areas in the 50s, or as low in the last 2 droughts. Did not result in subsidence, so it's not anticipated to be a problem in the future. But it will have its own section of the chapter, and it will basically address this data. Okay, now very quickly, just going to touch on projects and management actions. There's been 3 projects, 3 management actions identified as, likely to, occur in this basin. It's very important that these things be included in the GSP, because moving forward, that is a prerequisite to get funding, to get grant funding. So if you make the mistake of not including something that you might need money for in the future, I guess you got time 5 years from now, to correct that mistake. But it's important that they're included in the plan. So again, to me, I think of projects as things to me, a project is anything that involves construction. And ordinarily, I think of it as something that increases supply, but that's not really a hard and fast rule. And management actions are more on the demand management side. So the 3 projects that have definitely been identified is, the first one is the monitor well clusters along the coast that we said have already been applied for grant funding. Plans are in place, not to the extent that they know exactly where they're going to go, but they've applied for the funding. They plan to put in additional monitoring along the coast to monitor for seawater intrusion, because that's the biggest issue for this basin. And that's an easy one. It's just installing monitor wells. And, there's not a lot of associated infrastructure in addition to the wells. The big one that's definitely moving forward is the CAP project. It's an indirect potable reuse project. That's where they use highly treated wastewater, inject into the aquifer, and it's used primarily to, it uses the aquifer for storage, and then ultimately that water is picked up in the district's production wells. There's a lot of regulations involved in IPR. There's a lot of water quality, data that has to be shown and proved up. But this project is happening, right? They've already gotten funding for a large portion of it. They're applying for more funding in the future. And we'll get into details of it at the next meeting. But that's a project that's on the books. And the last one is a seawater barrier project, which would involve putting injection wells closer to the coast, as opposed to the ones for the CAP project are more in the center of the basin. If they go with the seawater barrier project, they would be injection wells along the coast. Could be necessary. It's not an established absolute fact that that'll be necessary yet. You know, the future model runs will shed a lot of light on that. You know, maybe the CAP project will, you know, help things enough that that might keep that at bay. That's not determined, but it's certainly recognized as a possibility. Yeah.
Are there thoughts on the source of the seawater barrier, the source for the injection water?
Yes, there are thoughts. Yeah, there are different ways to do it. We can move water, simply move water from one part of the basin to another. The preliminary thinking on the injection wells is that we would have injection wells at the coast come right off our distribution system, so we could actually move it from a well. We could import it from Kachuma, we could import it from state water. We could invite neighbors to store some water with a loss, you know, because when you inject at the coast, half of the water is going to go seaward and half of it's going to go inland. So those are all options.
And that sort of detail will get discussed a little more at the next meeting.
One quick question. Use the mic.
Use the mic.
Oh. So I've read all the IPR Project CAP stuff, much to my wife's chagrin because I read it while we were traveling through Europe, but it was a pretty big document. And so I know kind of where the injection wells are planned and that sort of thing, but is there any possibility that that water could be used for the seawater injection?
Indirectly, you know, probably not the molecules themselves, but, you know, in an accounting sense, we're creating 1,000 acre-feet of water a year, so we could use some of that for injection. It's relatively expensive water, so I think we prefer not to look at it as though we're developing the water and then just putting it back into the ocean, or half of it back into the ocean. I think there are other approaches that might be more beneficial to Carpinteria, such as having other people leave their water behind.
Yeah. Actually, you made a good point. It's all that water is kind of fungible. So yeah, I understand. Okay, thanks.
So you'll hear more about these next meeting, but those are the three primary projects that'll be getting discussed in the GSP. And then management actions, the things that, you know, we'll be wanting to mention in case there are grant opportunities in the future, is technical assistance for water use efficiency, both for, you know, agricultural users and potentially for municipal users. Well metering programs, you know, so so you can get a better measurement of what's actually getting pumped and used. And then again, improved monitoring. I mentioned it for the seawater intrusion, but also to address other data gaps that I mentioned in the past, like the you know, Ventura County area, you know, the area near Montecito, possibly this seawater or surface water, groundwater question that might require installation of some shallow piezometers. So those are the kind of management actions we'll be talking about. Again, this is just a brief intro to this, and that is it. Yeah.
So on that list, I would look at it as a little bit of a wish list and would hope that the creeks that are lined with concrete would be on that list of some way to improve the percolation rather than the loss of that water. Kind of thinking that there are some environmental folks and others who have raised that question, not just here, but for years. And thinking that the technology used by the Army Corps way back when those creeks were channelized, certainly has to have been improved on by now as far as ways to get a more natural creek, but also be able to handle the stormwater. So, you know, that list of projects and management actions, is that a 5-year list or a 50-year list? Is, you know, when we're talking about possible ways to improve our situation.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we've gotten there yet. You know, I'm not sure it's a wish list per se, because we are comparing the modeled analysis on all of our MTs and then looking at, okay, what do we need to do to make this work using projects and management actions? So if we list 100 projects, I think what you're saying is we need 100 projects to make this work, or maybe some variation of those projects. So it's possible we could put a list of projects together and say these are potential projects, these are preferred projects, something like that, where we've analyzed, you know, this handful of projects, and this is how it comes out with respect to minimum thresholds. We don't want to analyze 100 projects in our.
Well, when this came up in conversation at one of our early meetings, maybe even our first meeting, someone knowledgeable had said, well, that had been studied and it was a matter of 200 to 400 acre feet of water. Well, I'm thinking
That was a max, like during
max,
a wet year.
okay.
That was not an average. I didn't read the whole. It was looked at in the 2012 modeling report. Yeah. And I do recall there was a range, like, varied probably from close to 0 in a dry year to, maybe a couple 100 acre feet in an extremely wet year.
I think 200 was the average, wasn't it? Yeah.
Really? Well,
and was that for one creek or two? We've got 2 lined creeks, isn't that correct?
Yeah, we did as part of an earlier study when the model was originally developed back in 2000, whatever it was, 2008, 2012, that time frame. As part of that project, it was also a grant-funded project, we simulated a half dozen or so different projects in that, and delining the creeks was one of the simulations that we evaluated. And those creeks, Franklin and Santa Monica, if they were delined and went back to their sort of natural percolation capacity, was estimated to yield, I think it was around 200 acre feet a year on average.
So, but if I'm not mistaken, that was a modeling analysis. It wasn't like a full-on engineering analysis where
Correct.
they looked at costs and feasibility and
right. That would be the next step in the analysis. Would be, well, okay, 200 acre feet a year for purposes of discussion. That's that's significant. It's not trivial, but it's not a lot. It's not like 1,000 acre feet like you're getting with the CAP project, for example. And so to take that to the next step in terms of a feasibility analysis and then a cost-benefit analysis, how much would it cost to deline those creeks? Could you even get something like that permitted? That kind of, so it would take quite a bit of study to advance a project like that, I think.
But, maybe we should put it on the list. I mean, if it's already been looked at once, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we can probably in the GSP put it on the list and cite the earlier work that we had done on it, at least to get it, in the hopper, I guess. And, maybe that could be something that some grant funding might be made available in the future to support further analysis to see whether A, it's even technically feasible, permittingly feasible, and then, you know, what the cost estimate would be.
Well, and the other part of that could be, you know, a percolation basin sort of a system too. If there was land that wasn't productive, that might percolate and might even be in the right place for the saltwater intrusion problem. You know, I'm thinking over on the west side somewhere, where maybe the creek isn't de-lined, but it's diverted through a system like they've got to the south of us in an Oxnard area that are just using our imagination, I suppose.
Yeah, the concept of what you're referring to as off-stream spreading basins. There just hasn't been any study done on that. I think, you know, compared to Oxnard, where they're talking about taking water out of the Santa Clara River, which is a significant river, and putting it in a percolation basin, that's you know, several orders of magnitude greater flow than we get here coming down, you know, Rincon or Carpinteria. These creeks are relatively small. They don't run frequently. When they do run, it's very flashy, meaning you get, when the creeks are running, it's relatively short duration other than, you know, a year like this, of course. So it's certainly, you know, an interesting concept, and it you know, I wouldn't say it doesn't have merit. It certainly does, but I'm not aware of any technical investigations of doing something like that.
We did a sort of slightly different study as part of the facility study for the CAP. We looked at spreading basins as an option, and what we determined is there wasn't enough information to make a conclusion about where the water would end up. You know, kind of along the lines of, you know, would it benefit the coast in terms of level, and that land's very expensive in Carpinteria compared to a little hole where we can directly inject it right into the groundwater basin. So that's how we ended up with going with injection wells on CAP.
Just to follow up on that, and this is just one person's opinion, but it would be nice to see on there a little longer list of ways we can replenish the basin, you know, and it's sounding from me, you guys have said you've looked at some and that maybe there aren't any, but I guess my suggestion would be to be creative about that, because water is a, you know, replenishable commodity. And like along that lines, and when I read the report about the injection wells and using the wastewater, it seemed like we're still pumping some wastewater out to the ocean. And one of the questions I had just as a layman, why does anything go out to the ocean? You know, why don't we just pump everything back into the basin?
Well, there are solids in there that we can't use, and so we talked at a design level for the CAP project. We've talked about, you know, high rate recovery, which is somewhere around 94% of the water. I think right now we're 89. But the problems that come with that high level of recovery are the solids that you're left with are hard to move through pipes and get it out to the discharge where we're trying to actually get rid of it. So currently, you can imagine there's a waste stream that's been treated at the conventional wastewater treatment plant. It's then just put in a pipe with some chlorine and then dechlorinated and then pushed out into a ocean discharge. All we're doing is we're saying, well, there's some good water in there. Let's try to get as much as we can without completely affecting, you know, the existing operation and its ability to get rid of the waste.
Yes, so what you're saying is pretty much the plan does maximize what we can pull out of there.
Yeah, from a practical extent,
yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
You don't surf much in tar pits anymore, do you?
Hi, and for what it's worth, I was observing a project recently, and I'm trying to remember where it was, but where they were actually de-lining the creek, but they just did the bottom and they left the sides in place to, keep the structure there. And then there was also the additional benefit, which is maybe where they're getting grant money of kind of restoring the, what would you say, the biological diversity, so with either plants or animals like fish or something like that. So, that might be a good benefit.
Yeah, there's been talk about habitat restoration along those corridors. Again, I don't know if any of you know flood control people, but they don't really think in the same way as environmental or even any other folks. They're very single-minded. They want to have a facility that will be there at the end of the world, still conveying water off into the ocean as quickly as possible. So.
They get in trouble if there's one job they don't do, so they do that.
That's right. All right.
Okay, we're about out of time, so we're through SMCs as far as the public presentations go. Everybody will have the opportunity to provide public comment on the written chapter if you've got more to say. Can't tell you exactly when that'll be, within the next month or so, or maybe a month and a half. The next public workshop is May 17th.
Yeah,
and we'll be talking about more about projects and management actions.
You move on from the chapters. We're using the carpgsa.org website for all of the posting of all the document sections. So if you do have interest in looking at and commenting, you can do all of that through the website.
Did you set up an advisory committee?
Yes.
And I couldn't find the list of, because I was thinking I could go to people on the advisory committee if I wanted to understand things about it.
Yeah, there's two of them here.
All right, so both you guys are on it. Great, awesome.
Robert Abbott is on it too.
Oh, okay, good. But it'd be good maybe to have that list. I couldn't find the people listed on the website.
Okay, yeah, that's a good suggestion.
It's just the scheduled topics for the PAC meetings. That's the advisory committee that you were just asking about. I'm not going to get into the details of that small script, but are these PowerPoints posted on the
Yes.
website? Yeah, so it's there to see. That's it. So that's the presentation of SMCs, and that's what'll get written up, and everybody can comment to their heart's desire on all the picayune details of that.
And we'll be back with the projects and management actions next month. We'll have the question answered of whether we can list 100 projects or whether there's a downside to that.
Okay. Have a good evening.
All right, thank you.